Hi everybody, welcome to your second HSC course for modern history. It's on Russia and the Soviet Union, and it takes you from 1917 when there was a Russian Revolution right up to 1941. So it's a big unit. A lot happens that shapes much of the modern world as well. So the part that you're reading this week gives you all the background to the revolution, and the part that I'd like to unpack for you in a bit more detail in this teacher talk is zooming really in on the political system that existed in Russia before the revolution and the political theory that aimed to topple that system. So to understand that, the first thing I want to introduce you to is the Age of Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement that spread through Europe in the 18th century. And it was basically a movement of ideas. So Enlightenment thinking. Enlightenment thinking was all about ideas like equality, justice, freedom, fraternity. You can see there on the screen. You might not know that word, but it means brotherhood, liberty. So for us as modern people, you might hear these terms and think, yeah, you're quite comfortable with the idea of equality and freedom. In fact, many of our laws are underpinned by Enlightenment thinking today. But in the 18th century, these ideas were very, very fresh. Until that point, really, the man with the biggest stick won. Power and privilege was standard across Europe. So this idea of equality was very, very new, and it was spreading like wildfire. Ideas are very powerful. They almost have a life unto themselves. And what was happening is intellectuals were being exposed to Enlightenment thinking and then casting their eye on their own political systems from the countries that they were from and thinking, well, is our political system underpinned by these concepts? Is it providing freedom, equality, justice to the people that it rules? You might remember from the prelim course, they talked about the Decembrists. That was like a military coup in Russia. And they basically tried to overthrow the Tsar, the ruler at the top of the political system in Russia. And, it was fiercely crushed and crushed quickly. But they were actually, the men that were the Decembrists were actually ex-military, and they'd fought in the Napoleonic Wars. And while they were there, they were exposed to Enlightenment thinking. And, exactly that. These intellectuals returned from the Napoleonic Wars, looked at Russia, and looking at it through the lens of the Enlightenment, they saw a system that was corrupted. Russia has a history of revolt and resistance against the political system. All right, so that's kind of the backdrop. So let's now just unpack very quickly, and you'll probably remember from your prelim course, what is the system that was happening in Russia before the revolution. So it was your classic hierarchy. You had the few ruled by the many. At the top, you've got the Tsar and his aristocracy or nobility. Under that was the church, or also known as the clergy. And the important thing to remember about the power of the church is the Tsar being supported by the church was very powerful. It was the Russian Orthodox Church. Because what that told the people was the Tsar ruled by divine right. He had the authority of God to rule over them. And this was very powerful because you must remember that at this time, the people at the bottom of this pyramid, the workers, the peasants, the serfs, were mostly uneducated. And so, the fear of God and the belief in God was very powerful in many of their lives. So how do you topple an oppressive system like this? If you start to apply Enlightenment thinking to this, freedom, equality, you can see very clearly this is not an equal system, and it's almost designed to be oppressive. It so relies upon the Tsar being a good man. It's like that old fable, good King Arthur. These systems, it's like an old feudal system, rely on the top person, whether it be the king or the Tsar, being good and treating the people well. And this often didn't happen. To be fair, many Tsars in Russia throughout the 19th century attempted reforms, and you might remember that from the prelim course as well. Remember, the serfs were emancipated, which means freed. there was also in the early 20th century, one of the Tsars, the last Tsar, introduced a parliament to appease, the resistance movements coming from further down in the hierarchy. But what all of these Tsars had in common as they tried to make reform, they would, as soon as they felt any sense that they were losing their power, they would often respond and react by returning to extremely repressive policies again. And so you might remember that pattern from the prelim course as we took you through different reforms that different Tsars had made. Okay, so let's have a look at the theory that aims to topple this. Basically, it's called Marxism, and it's based on a philosopher called Karl Marx from Germany. And his theory was quite simple. He believed, well, it's not quite simple, actually, it's exceptionally complex, but it's simple in that he believed that there was a human evolutionary imperative, and that it was almost like our destiny to overcome these hierarchies of class, and it was our destiny to become free. He believed that the way that would happen is through stages. He believed that it would move from feudalism. Feudalism would give way to capitalism, and we would go through a capitalist stage, which you may know, we are currently living in a capitalist society. All of the West is ruled under capitalist theory. And then that would finally give way, after a dictatorship of the proletariat, to communism. So feudalism will give way to capitalism, which will finally give way to communism, where Karl Marx believed there would be full freedom and no class. So let's unpack it in a bit more detail. You have feudalism. Feudalism would be broken, which is the hierarchy, much like the autocracy of Russia, where the aristocracy and the middle class will go up against each other. There will be a struggle, a resistance from the middle class, who will overthrow the aristocracy and take economic and political power. This will create capitalism, where business owners and the middle class and the bourgeoisie and middle class are the same thing. Bourgeoisie is the French word for middle class. They will give way to, they will take economic and political power. Now, what Karl Marx says is we don't stop there. What we next need to do is to topple capitalism. And that will be the next class struggle, which will be the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. The proletariat is another word for worker. And there will be an armed revolution, which will lead to a dictatorship of the proletariat. So the proletariat will overthrow the middle class. And the belief is that there needs to be a dictatorship for a short period of time to ensure the middle class doesn't retake control. And there'll be a strong centralised government, an organised system to maintain the control, maintain the revolution, make sure it doesn't just fall back into the hands of the middle class. And this will finally give way to communism, where there will be no class, no government, full freedom, and wealth will be distributed evenly. So let's have a little look at the first stage. Feudalism is giving way to capitalism. The aristocracy have been overthrown by the middle class. But let's have a look at a diagram of capitalism. The irony about it is the same hierarchy. We have the same struggle. We have the same few, many being ruled by the few. The only difference is who's on top. So we've got money right at the top in the capitalist system. You then have your government and your corporation. You may have a figurehead, like Britain still has the Queen, so do we. And you have your government. You've then still got your church, very powerful, your military. And here's your middle class or bourgeoisie who still have much power, but they're a larger group of people. And then again, you still have your workers holding it all up. And you can see this sort of summary here, we rule you, we fool you, we shoot you, we eat for you, we work for you. And this here, we feed everyone, that's your farmer. And in the Russian system, that would be your peasant farmer. So the interesting thing is, according to Karl Marx, and when you see this diagram, I think it's a fairly factual diagram of capitalism, he is correct that it doesn't quite create, it's just a different power structure, but it is still very, very similar to feudalism. And this is why he says that the next stage must be that capitalism is only a stage in our evolution and must go through another class struggle in order to reach communism. And this is where you have the dictatorship of the proletariat. And if you have a look, I forgot. I wanted to unpack this. This is where the complication of Russian Marxism occurs, because here you have, this one here, bourgeoisie versus proletariat. This is a armed revolution by the proletariat. This is where it gets complicated for Russia. Oh, what's happened there? I'm sorry, guys. Oh, okay. Russia did not industrialize at the same rate as the rest of the rest of Europe. So during the 18th and 19th century, Europe was you would have read about the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization is the process of moving towards large-scale mechanized industry. So technology allowed suddenly for mass production of all sorts of things. Factories are going up everywhere and cities are being built, and you have this process of urbanization, which is the building of cities, that goes hand in hand with industrialization. Now, Karl Marx's theory is completely determined by a proletariat revolution. The proletariat are the workers of industry. Okay, they're not your peasant farmers. These guys are underprivileged and exploited in factories and cities. So how do you, in Russia, where you only have a very small degree of industrialization, have a proletariat revolution? And this became one of the complexities of Russian Marxism. In 1897, the census in Russia said only 4% of Russia's population were actually the proletariat. So how do you have a proletariat revolution with such a small number? Now, this is where a lot of Marxism begins to divide in Russia, because people had different ideas about how to manifest communism. Some believed you could skip the socialist stage altogether, because the stage between between capitalism and communism, they often refer to as the socialist revolution. And many leaders of the movement in Russia said, we can skip the socialist revolution and go straight to the communism, because many peasants actually lived in communes already. Anyway, I'll let you read those sort of details in the actual part. So I just want to really wrap that up. Make sure you use that diagram a lot to just understand it. But where I talked about the socialist revolution, that's here between capitalism and the dictatorship. The armed revolution is often referred to as a socialist revolution, which will give way to communism. And look, it makes sense. If you have a look there, it does make sense. Karl Marx's theory of a proletariat revolution makes sense. If the workers at the bottom rock this boat, everything falls. They really do have the power, surely. And so it's an interesting thing, because, as we know, capitalism is very much still in existence. Capitalism's been given a really bad rep because of this triangle, because of the innate inequalities that are built into the system. You often see this kind of stuff where, you've got the greedy capitalist pig, just raping the world and getting rich. This one here, you have all the workers, going into the big factories in the cities, working, while, again, the capitalists get rich. This one here, on the right, you have the workers trying to pull down the capitalist power. So it's certainly really interesting, Karl Marx theory. Marxism is absolutely key to the Russian Revolution, but the complexity begins because they weren't heavily industrialized. You had a massive peasant population that were not entirely on board, or took a lot longer to become involved. So, yeah, enjoy. Read the part now with that backdrop of how the political theory underpins the revolution. Enjoy. Thanks.